So welcome to this World Retail Congress report, looking at the effect of this COVID-19 pandemic on retail. And I'm delighted to have with me Deborah Weinswig, who's a great supporter of the World Retail Congress, but is founder and CEO of Coresight Research, which is one of the most respected research houses looking at retail really around the world, but obviously is experts on the US, but obviously Asia and China in particular. And this is a global situation. So welcome, Deborah. Thanks for talking to me.
Thank you for having
me. Really just thinking back a matter of weeks to retailing as was, it does feel like we've entered a whole new world, and it seems hard to imagine how things were before. So really to start us off, I'd be really interested to get your thoughts now we're some weeks into this pandemic. Really, what is the effects that you feel this is going to have on retail? I mean, does this have the capacity to change everything?
Well, it's interesting. I think what we had the first few weeks was just shock. And, it was hard. People were, kind of just looking at their expenses, which was really the right place to start. And so, can we pay rent? Does it make sense for us to do marketing? What are we going to do with store employees? And so really rethinking their expense base. And then also, so I felt like it was let's cut expenses. Let's look at our liquidity. Can we access the debt markets? And we're kind of through that for the most part. So that was kind of the shock. Now we're in the realization mode, and it's, okay, our 90% of our stores are closed, and where do we, kind of think that we can drive revenues? Is that online? Do we need a partner? Do we need to do, what is it that we need to do at this point to rethink our existence? And it's amazing, like what we've seen in China is all of these, I call them like mashups. So, right, like McDonald's and Adidas made like a shoe. Levi's and New Balance made a shoe. Supreme and Lamborghini. I mean, I could go on and on. But to me, right, we're seeing kind of this innovation that's stemming from, what's an unfortunate crisis, but uncommon partners are working together. And I think that we need to see more of that in the West, because if there's something that's right, limited time, limited quantity, limited offer, I do think that we will see, transactions occur similar to what we did in China during, their lockdown period.
Yeah. So we are in lockdown, but food stores primarily are the only stores that are allowed to open. As you've been observing around the world in the markets that you analyze, how do you think food retail has been coping with this unprecedented period?
It's very interesting. Many of the food retailers that we've spoken to are, their number one focus is keeping their customers and their employees safe, and, making and trying to figure out exactly what safe is. We're also seeing, those retailers like a Walmart or a Target and many others who had really focused on this idea of curbside or pickup, that has really worked in their favor because the technology is there, the systems are there. Others are really trying to quickly catch up. The other kind of interesting thread that we've heard is this idea of, assortment optimization. So, okay, a typical grocer has between 50,000 and 60,000 SKUs. If we can really stay in stock and do a great job on 3,000, those is the kind of lowest number we've heard, does it make sense for us to rethink kind of what we're bringing in, how we're merchandising it? And, some of the interesting things we're seeing in terms of physical store is, right, there's like arrows on the store in terms of like the direction for traffic. And why that's also important in this idea of 3,000 SKUs is protecting kind of the e-commerce teams. So whether it's the teams who are delivering product or those who are just delivering into the parking lot, this, kind of buy online, pick up in store, or for, kind of pure e-commerce delivery, if they're picking from a smaller assortment, there is this idea that, they can keep themselves a little bit safer and, keep the customer safer as well. So that's been the big focus right now. And certainly these retailers have shown unprecedented innovation.
Yeah. But sadly for non-food, all those stores are closed, and, apparel, fashion, and all those sectors. I mean, what's your sense of what is going to happen to those retailers? Certainly in the UK and US, we've seen, those weaker retailers already being swept away, aren't we?
We are starting to see, once again, this idea of some partnerships, though. Kind of DSW just announced something, and we've spoken to some of the, kind of retailers whom we work with, and we said, baby is considered essential. Is there a way to kind of rethink your store around, kind of that offering? And, I feel like, once again, being in this like realization mode, we're realizing that our sales because our physical stores for the most part are closed, are challenging. There is this opportunity, of course, online, but many of these retailers were also very much in their infancy, if you will, in terms of great e-commerce. I mean, they all had it, but in terms of being, amazing. And we are also seeing this idea of, it's been very interesting the last few days, more around demand forecasting. Should they be investing in e-commerce, and where, and how to kind of really improve their offering to the consumer? And, these are the retailers, I think, who have, enough liquidity, who feel that they'll make it through. So they do want to take some time and invest so that they can get as much in terms of sales as is available right now.
Yeah. So do you think those retailers that are sort of slower into e-commerce, or maybe there's some formats that don't have e-commerce, do you think we're going to come out of this period with retailers really ramping up their e-commerce, as a consequence of what we're seeing?
It's interesting, once again, going back to the grocers, some of the numbers I've gotten, right? So there's about 2% penetration of e-commerce in grocery right now. And many of them have said they're up to about, kind of, let's call it, they've added 1,000 basis points, so about 12%. The feeling is, and hey, this is where we stand now today, in late April, that about half of that will kind of go back to in-store shopping once the consumer is, kind of back to normal, or we're calling it rejoice, right? Realization, recovery, rejoice. And the other thing that's been interesting is we had stimulus checks here in the US. We talked to many retailers who sell, kind of sleepwear, loungewear, socks, intimates, real basics. They saw a 50% spike around the stimulus checks. And I do think the more that the local, kind of, and national and federal governments can pump into the consumer, we will see them spend. I mean, that's the positive, because I think there is a, what's different here too, right? If we go back, I was working in investment banking during the global recession, right? The markets like froze here, because at least domestically, because a lot of what was put in place, right? All the, high yield market is working, people can access it. And so that's the positive. And I do think that we're seeing, the consumer is fairly confident in terms of our ability to kind of, move through this. And so when they're getting, a stimulus, they are spending it, not necessarily kind of, putting it away for a rainy day.
That's a really good point. So moving on to my next question really is around consumer behaviors. The longer this goes on, in particular the lockdown, I mean, what do you think you'll see might be the longer term effects on consumer behavior? One of the pieces in this next issue for the World Retail Congress report says that it takes just 8 weeks to change our behaviors. So we're getting close to that sort of period, and we've all been living our lives very differently. I mean, what are you seeing at Coresight in terms, because you're obviously doing a rolling consumer research programs, what are you starting to see, and what are you predicting?
Well, it's interesting. I've heard both sides of the coin. So it's, this idea that we've like basically been, kind of living in loungewear, and, this idea that people want to run back to the office and don suits again. There's that side. The other is, this idea that, maybe we work from home 3 out of 5 days a week, or 2 out of 5 days a week, right? We've all coped and we've all gotten very comfortable. We're all saving, commute times, right? It's much more green and sustainable and all of that. And this idea that maybe we don't, kind of need quite as much as we thought. And ultimately, we won't let other people per se, kind of help us make those decisions. We'll buy kind of what is important to us. And I do think that those are some of the changes. And, what we've seen kind of, I would say, coming out of China is this idea, like, beauty has continued to be incredibly important. And from like a mass perspective, right, it's eyes up. So that's one thing. Secondly, anything that, you feel is very unique, that you love, right? Not somebody else telling you. We're seeing those items, sell out in minutes. So once again, anything it's very like limited time, limited quantity, limited offering, that's continued to be important. And then how can we start to build and continue this relationship with the consumer, during, this period of lockdown. And so, what we've seen in China, right, is live streaming. Here we're seeing kind of, retailers try different things, even if it's simple as putting a video on the site of the CEO talking and having a message, and then lastly, a lot of the higher end retailers who have like a book, right? They've been calling, actually picking the phone and calling their, kind of those whom they have a relationship with on the client side, and continuing to have that relationship, and those who have access to inventory, trying to drive sales even in this environment. So we are seeing, sales are occurring. They're not at the level that they were, but at the same time, we don't have like a physical store. And then one other thing you are starting to see, there's a company, and I'm sure there's many others, called Obsessed VR, where, Dior's working with them, this like almost digital footprint of a store. And, this is kind of the stuff we've dreamed about, right? And we're seeing it in this environment, and it's driving transactions, and it's, kind of keeping these retailers top of mind for all of us. Because I do agree with you, if they're not top of mind, or if they're not even in our mind, because, right, we're not out and about, that's when we start to worry about, I hate to even use the word, but this idea of some of these retailers, becoming extinct.
Yeah. You're also very close to startups right around the world and the States and beyond. What is happening to that sector? Have they had to go into kind of hibernation at the moment? Are they able to keep going in this period where I guess cash flows are really under pressure and retailers are locking down themselves in terms of focusing on what they need to do?
It's interesting. Those who were kind of, in the kind of pre-concept have just, for the most part, decided to take an extended vacation, because if you don't have a product right now is potentially, not the best time because there's also nobody to experiment with, right? You can't do proofs of concept, et cetera. So you can continue to fine tune your idea, but what we're finding is those who had any kind of technology around e-commerce, around, kind of driving visibility for the retailer in a virtual way, we continue to see high demand for those. And and we've even started to see some, pivot, who are really working on the fashion industry, turn more towards CPG and retail. And I would say I've had a surprising amount of calls with startups who are doing better than they would have expected given the environment. And some are really doing incredibly well. Anyone who's offering kind of, a VR or any other, merged reality, anything that allows the consumer to experience the store virtually, we're seeing is very strong right now. Anyone doing like demand forecasting, predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, there is still I would say a genre of, startups where we are seeing real strength right now.
Yeah. Another area of focus is huge pressure on retailers to really cut back on their inventory and to cancel orders in the pipeline, and the downward pressure that's putting right back through the supply chain onto suppliers, inevitably. What are you hearing about what is happening in those relationships and also in the supply sector? Because there's going to be a time lag when normal life resumes. We're going to potentially be a season behind, or it's going to be a real mess, isn't it, in terms of where retailers are carrying stock and what the suppliers, can they carry the pressure that they're being put under as well?
So what's been most interesting to me is in this era of sustainability, we really thought 2020 would, right at the beginning of the year, that was the hottest topic in retail. And I still think it's underlying a lot of decisions that are being made. So many retailers are talking about packing away the seasonal inventory for next year, the same season. And that is something we haven't heard in over a decade. That's number one. Number two, they are canceling, as much as they possibly can, if not all. And most companies we've heard are buying at about 50% of their 2019 level for holiday 2020, with the idea that they can chase up to about 65% of 2019 levels. And that seems to be about where people think, or where retailers think, we'll kind of come out of this. Third, we are seeing, what's been fascinating to me, and Ian, you and I spoke before we started this, we've worked with many other large tech companies and retailers to start something called Retailers Unite, which is this idea of, kind of retooling factories and helping startups think about how to make PPE. And we are seeing many of those in the supply chain who have switched over their factories quickly, or who already had the capability. And in some cases, it was just a matter of getting fabric. So there is a whole industry, right? And it's spread up incredibly quickly, but this kind of PPE industry. And so those who were only doing, kind of a certain type of production previously have switched their lines quickly and been able to, continue at the production levels they were before, if not higher. The challenge, though, has been, Ian, is the cost of air freight is in some cases more expensive than the cost of the garment. And, ocean freight is very inexpensive right now, but air is, because, right, there's limited, if you will, there's limited capacity available. So that's been the real challenge. But I have been impressed with how thoughtful they've been, and how, and I think that there is a confidence that can be had from what we saw in China, to move through this. And I do think that that's generated a lot of the confidence from the retailers, from those in the supply chain, and those all the way back to the mills in terms of what we're seeing.
Yeah. Going back to that, looking at the retail landscape coming out of this crisis, would you summarize it saying we're going to have fewer stores, which has been talked about as a long time? We've got overcapacity in many markets. You monitor. I noticed sort of store openings and closures in the States and in Europe, and have done for a while. But this presumably is going to give that obviously it's a negative, but maybe in the long term it could be a positive in terms of that realignment of retail on and offline.
We've spoken to many shopping mall REIT executives, and the general feeling seems to be that in the A malls, of which there are about 350, 400, we'll see about 20 to 30% of tenants not make it through the crisis. When you start to move into B malls, the feeling is about 50%. So that's a real change in the landscape. And I personally believe those whom are vertically integrated, right, those who kind of sell their own brand, they will move through this in a better and stronger, kind of assuming that there's demand for their brand, because they have something that's unique. If you are, kind of a multi-brand retailer, we do believe, and we're already starting to see that those retailers are weaker and will continue to get weaker, unfortunately. And that is where I think that, potentially, and we are hearing what's interesting is some of those retailers are looking to acquire, some of the D2C brands, once again, to offer a more interesting assortment, to offer this kind of idea of vertically integrated assortment. But I do think we'll come out of this with fewer retailers, and those whom, kind of make it through will be those that are vertically integrated.
And finally, Deborah, China is now emerging from the lockdown, the first into the crisis, and now first out. You monitor China very closely. What are you seeing and hearing about how China is emerging? And again, those issues around how consumers are behaving. We hear about this trend of, is it revenge shopping, they call it, where people are
yes.
Desperate to get out and they spend money because they haven't been able to.
Well, and I want to also harken back. I mean, one of the, I think, things that we don't hear enough discussed is that, China and, right, we went through SARS. And so that was one of the reasons that we were able to handle it, this whole crisis, I think, so easily, if you will. Not that there's anything easy about it, but, I think you saw a different level of response from the consumer in terms of protecting himself or herself, but also, kind of those on the other side, and acting very quickly and knowing that we would kind of get to the other side. So that's number one. Number two, if you think about, this is something I haven't heard discussed much, I think it's important to mention, we're also very positive on luxury, right? About 2/3 of luxury sales happen in China, and about, 1/3 is bought in China, 1/3 is the outbound Chinese tourist, and about 1/3 is like the daigou who brings it in, for the consumer there. And if you don't have the outbound Chinese tourist, which I don't think we'll have for quite some time, that consumer will be spending domestically. And I am very positive as it relates to luxury, especially, kind of this very, kind of deep relationship that they've built with their consumers. And I do think that with the Chinese tourists not traveling and, them kind of being on the other side of this, we'll continue to see sales, kind of across the spectrum. But once again, I do think, we've built this hourglass so that that product that sits in the, kind of top part, which is, more unique, less quantity, and, where you have this, kind of unique relationship and strong relationship with your customer. We do believe, and we are seeing that those brands who are more in the middle of the hourglass, right, where there's less differentiation and less interesting product, they are still struggling in China. But those at the top are, already seeing this revenge shopping. But even, kind of during the thing is, like, think about an International Women's Day, right, which is March 8th, right? Certainly in the middle of the crisis for China, we saw brands like a Lululemon, Estee Lauder, kind of Shiseido and other beauty brands saw comps over 200%. And I think that does say something in terms of the importance of live streaming, the relationship these brands have built with their consumers, and that, kind of China will emerge from this very quickly in terms of getting back to. So even though this idea that 8 weeks it takes to form a new habit, I think that because we continue to have the relationship between the brand and the consumer through live streaming and WeChat and other means, they never really kind of changed, if you will, what brands were important to them. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that in terms of how we, in the West, if you will, continue to build those relationships with our customers.
Yeah. Deborah, it's fascinating as ever. I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation, and we covered lots there that we'll be exploring more in our World Retail Congress reports, but it'd be great to have another conversation with you in a few weeks' time to see how things are emerging. Thank you again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you. Thanks.